with relational home visits, we know the impact of home visits. The parent-teacher home visit program has done really good research on that home visits. I had the opportunity to visit them a few years ago, and we've had the opportunity to have them do training with some of our educators here in Saskatchewan. So we often follow, we definitely follow their non-negotiables. We follow so many of their structures. It truly is just a visit, really intended to know each other, to build trust and relationships. We often have tea or coffee or whatever our families offer us. And the conversations, as you know from the work of the PTHV, is we'll ask them to tell us about their child, to tell us about themselves and their family. We ask them what they do when they're not in school. We tell them about ourselves, of course. We discuss their hopes and dreams for their child. We discuss their expectations for the school year of us, and so on. So really beautiful visits that are happening there. You'll see the teacher Melanie in the middle. I mean, she would home visit all day, every day if her school would let her. She absolutely loves it. And she had been visiting a number of her families, and she was finding that, you know, they loved offering a meal, coffee, tea, etc. And they'd often sit on the floor on a carpet or some newspaper or whatever to have their meal. And all of a sudden one day, Melanie said, "Oh my gosh, I have in my classroom," you can see that Melanie's white. She was raised here in Saskatchewan. And she said, "I have a kitchen in my pre-kindergarten classroom that looks like the kitchen I have in my home." And she dismantled it. She took it apart. She put a piece of fabric on the floor. She put food and toy food and dish items on the floor, and the kids immediately began to use it. But without the dwelling in, she wouldn't have understood that what she was representing in her classroom wasn't representative of her kids and families. And she made that beautiful change as a result. So what we learn, we take back. What do we do with that piece? We've started a practice here called Cooking for Cohesion. It's something that I'm just loving, really passionate about it as a way to dwell with families. I heard of this idea in Australia. I was at Emmaus College, a high school in the state of Queensland, and the kids were getting together across cultures to do Cooking for Cohesion. And I loved the idea and thought, boy, we can take that idea up. We can use it with our families. And what had happened in this school in which I was doing my research project, there was 1/3 of the population were Indigenous, 1/3 were newcomers, many of whom were Muslim, and 1/3 were dominant Canadian. And a white grandpa said to me one morning, "Nobody talks to me." Like, we had coffee on in the foyer and stuff. Parents were invited to linger. And he said, "I can't get these women to talk with me." And he didn't understand some of the male-female gender differences between Muslim and non-Muslim people. They were also learning English, and he wondered if maybe it was a language barrier and so on. But the sense that we stay in our cultural groups apart from each other, and some parents and families are more marginalized on the school landscape than others. So we began this process of Cooking for Cohesion. What the intent of it is we're using food as a way to know one another. Food as a way to bridge gaps. So you'll see the man on the right, Bassem. He was one of the first families. He and Fadia were one of the first families that we did Cooking for Cohesion with. And what we invited them to do is to show us their foods, show us the items they cooked with, let us touch them, smell them, taste them, and so on. We provided the money for them to cook a meal for us. We watched that process unfold. We asked questions and so on. And then we sat down together to eat this beautiful Syrian food. And that's when Bassem and Fadia then told us their stories. Where did they come from? What was it like to escape Syria? What were their hopes and dreams for their kids now that they were here? They showed us pictures of their families. They showed us this pile of rubble that was their home in Syria. And so it just brought us closer together. You'll see in that, I love that picture on the right, that's a director of education, which is our most senior position in a school division. And Bassam is teaching Quentin how to do their dance, because men dance with men. Look at the laughter and look at the fun. And so how are you not friends after this relationship? We did this on the floor of the school gym one time, and Bassam looked out at everyone sitting on plastic tablecloths, on blankets, on newspaper, who had just eaten this meal that a number of Syrian families had prepared. And Bassam looked at them and said, "We have shared a meal together. You are now my family." And one of our dominant Canadian moms, a white mom, sat there with tears running down her face, and she said, "I am going to accept that responsibility to be part of your family." And so this is something we're doing to bring the margins to the center, to not have anybody marginalized, to have this group of families become core on the school landscape. And so we've done it a number of different times: Bangladeshi families, Syrian families, Ethiopian families, and so on. So just another way to dwell in, to know, to learn. Again, like I said, funds of knowledge, home culture, parent knowledge of their children. Then we can switch. So we can continue to dwell in homes and community, but we can dwell with families on our school landscapes too. We want them over time to feel comfortable to come and see us and to come and take part in the things that are unfolding at school, seeing it as their place too, seeing it as a place they can have voice and be a part of their children's teaching and learning. And so we use a few activities that help us with that. One of the things we've done is turned Meet the Teacher Night, which often happens at the beginning of a new school year, into Meet the Family Night, right? It isn't about us. It's about them, right? We are working with their children and their families. And so, I mean, we can share information about ourselves that night too. They can look up the curriculum. It's often available. So we want to make it about the families. So we'll often choose a book that's appropriate for our cultural group, our school. Yours will probably look different. And we use it as a way for families, a prompt for families to pull some things together in their home, artifacts that help them tell us who they are, or to share parts of their family story. Wilfred Gordon MacDonald Partridge comes from Mem Fox in Australia. Wilfred finds out his friend Nancy, Miss Nancy, at the senior's place next door is losing her memory. And so he tries to figure out what a memory is. And people tell him it's something as precious as gold. It's something from long ago. It's something that makes you laugh. It's something that makes you cry, and so on. So Wilfred puts a basket of items together. And so that's one we might use in our communities. May not be appropriate for yours, but a book like that gives families a sense, what could we put in our basket? Each family brings their basket, their bag, their box, their items, and they sit in clusters around the classroom and they tell who they are. And we all get to know each other. The teacher knows the families begin to know each other. Again, we create a web of relationships, a web of connection. I could give you a list of books. They may not be culturally suitable in your area, but I'm sure those are things you can do. But using that time to build relationship right from the beginning. Taken for Granted Teacher, Meet the Teacher Night becomes now a Dwelling in Meet the Family Night. This is a very similar type of activity, again, often done on the school landscape, where the teacher makes a family chandelier. So rather than bringing artifacts, maybe they bring little pieces of paper, beads, coins, things that are important, feathers, rocks, shells. And the teacher has materials, pictures of themselves, little pieces of paper they can draw things on, write things on. Each family's given a strand of wire, of jute, of cord of some kind, and they put their items on the strand. They then use those strands, just as I shared in the other example, to tell each other who they are, to introduce themselves to the teacher and one another. All of those strands then form the family chandelier that hangs as a centerpiece of that classroom for the rest of the year. So new ones can be added as new families come, etc. So we're building that sense that everyone has voice in place. Everybody matters. We see you. And we're going to build our curriculum out of the fabric of your lives. One last example that I'll share before I open things up is that the engagement in curriculum in the teaching and learning is such an important piece. We know that. The research is really clear that when parents are engaged in their children's teaching and learning, that's when we see that impact on student outcomes. So one of our teachers, often she's a grade 1 teacher, she'll begin her year with this big idea: math lives everywhere. And then she'll ask them, where does math live in your home? Where does it live in your culture? Where does it live in your community? And she talks to the parents and the kids about that. And then they do that search for math in their own homes. As they bring back all kinds of items, she has her children sort them into what she calls cultural math bins. These are about problem solving. These are about number. These are about pattern. These are about geometry, and so on. And so what you'll see in this picture is a little boy with his father. They're from Nigeria originally, and the dad had a game that they played in his village in Nigeria, and he wanted to teach it to the children. So now the dad is engaged in math curriculum, but in a way that's natural and authentic, and that keeps him in the place of parent, doesn't ask him to be a pretend teacher with his child. He wears his Nigerian patterned shirt, and look at the engagement that's happening there as he then becomes a curriculum maker in that classroom. What happened during this particular moment is one of the young boys in the class said, "Hey, that's like an egg carton." And so every child in the class then painted an egg carton, collected seeds or shells or beads, and made their own game. And then they were taking those games home to their families and being the ones who taught them the math game. So we want the ways in which we work with our families to be built on trust, to be built on respect, to honor their knowledge in whatever way it comes, to be culturally sensitive and responsive, to be respectful. And I think for me always then, to always keep parents in the place of parent. That's their important role, and that's what we want them to be doing. So if we come back to this notion then, so here you see Momina, a Pakistani mom, there's a Pakistani grandma with her. They're playing with the children on the floor in the pre-kindergarten room. And Momina, I happened to be there in that moment, and Momina was playing Lego with the children, and she was telling them the colors in Bangla, the words for the colors in Bangla, and they were counting in Bangla. And so what happens, I think, when we dwell in, we see the knowledge families hold, we see the richness they bring as educators, and we make space for them in our classrooms, and we make space for them in our curriculum. We're still honoring those commonplaces of student, of teacher, of subject matter, but look how naturally and richly the milieus just up the possibility for outcomes for kids feeling that they have a place in school, that their identity is honored, that who they are, that they can use their language, that all of that has a place in school as well as outside of school. So again, just my information. I've got my email and my phone number there. I do have a Twitter account if you want to tweet anything or be in touch with me there. I have a website. I've put it there. You can see more of my work if anything interests you. And I have a Facebook page as well. So if you want to join a conversation about parent engagement, that's also a possibility. So let's open it up to conversations. Yesenia will moderate for us. I don't know if there are questions in the chat or things you want to ask more about. I tried not to take too long on anything, so we'd have some time for us to visit with one another.
Debbie, I have a couple of things here in the chat. One from Mary Beth. She says, how are teachers encouraged, compensated to do things outside school hours to indwell with families? I am thinking you must have to meet with families nights and weekends as many parents work during the day.
Yeah, that's a really complex question, and it's one we're still working on figuring out here too, Mary Beth. So for example, for our pre-kindergarten teachers, it's legislated here in our province that they get time to do home visits with their families, but they're the only teacher group that does. And so then we're looking at ways that perhaps home visits can take the place of, say, an extracurricular activity. So I don't know, instead of coaching a volleyball team, you use your time for home visits. We've looked at things like, if I'm the principal in the school, I take Yesenia's class and Yesenia can go out and do a home visit with one of her families. We've talked about using teacher professional development time. We've talked about using staff meeting time. What if the first X amount of minutes of the staff meeting became a home visit time instead of being the agenda that was unfolding. With the parent-teacher home visit project, as many of you will know, that teachers are paid for their visits, and we did a home visit pilot in our province last year, and we followed that precedent, that non-negotiable. We paid teachers and staff for those home visits. We're now looking at a province of how that might look in the future as we move forward. In our province, teachers are given pay or time in lieu if they supervise at lunchtime. And so we're arguing that supervising lunch isn't a high impact activity, but we're giving teachers pay or time in lieu for it. What if instead we had solved the lunchroom problem a different way and had teachers do home visits and gave them pay or time in lieu for that? So we don't have a perfect answer. We're trying lots of things. And we're trying to figure it out depending on context, community, and so on. So I hope that gives you a little bit of idea or possibility. Thanks for that.
Sarah says, this has been so great. Thank you. How can we dwell within families when designing curriculum for emergent bilinguals? How can we include parents' knowledge and home culture when creating meaningful activities for home use for parents that do not speak English?
Yeah. I don't always believe that they have to speak English, right? So one of our doctoral students, Emma Chen, is looking at translanguaging and looking at that concept that it's not about you have an English language repertoire and then, let's say, a Bangla language repertoire. You have one language repertoire. So how do we, instead of trying to separate them, how do we bring them together? So when we began working in this particular school, many of the parents who were coming into the school didn't speak English. The kids often spoke more English than them, but everybody learned together, right? And in the classroom, teachers would be speaking in English, kids and parents might be speaking in their own language. There was a whole mix of language possibility, every language scaffolding the other. And so Melanie, the one teacher that I mentioned, did family journals, where with her little 3- and 4-year-olds, she just stapled pieces of paper together, called it a family journal, and invited kids to write family stories, to draw pictures. And that journal went back and forth between home and school, trying to capture what they were doing with their families when they weren't at school with her. And those, again, she encouraged them, use any language you want, right? Draw, paste photos in, do whatever. So I think if we just open our hearts and minds to families, they will show us what they're comfortable to do. Like Momina naturally played Lego and used her own language to teach color, number, and so on. Families are coming in and reading in their own language or telling stories in their own languages. So I don't know, again, just a couple of examples, perhaps.
Thank you. Speaking about kind of letting families show us the way, or students, Christy has a question about, do you have any advice on avoiding coming across as intrusive during home visits?
I think it's always about making the appointment ahead of time and being sure the family knows you're coming and has invited you to come. I mean, I think we want our home visits always to be voluntary. So we make the offer and we wait for them to take up that invitation. Teachers have done things like started with popsicles in the park. So they might invite families to come and play on the play equipment with their children, and they have a big, cooler full of popsicles, and they just play and use popsicles as a treat and so on. It's cold here in winter. People have done that cocoa and conversation, and it doesn't have to be a home visit. I think a home visit's better because that's where we learn about the home culture, more so. But I think, it can be a porch visit, it can be a step visit, it can be a walk by, it can be a drop in, it can be a cafe, it can be, can I buy you a coffee at whatever the local place is, or a tea, it can be a parking lot at the school. Like, again, I think there's many ways, and we just have to gauge our families and what they want. What's really interesting to me is our newcomer families are the most just throwing open their doors and wanting us to come in. And probably our Indigenous families the least, with good reason, because they've been hurt a lot by the system. And so we work with them. Sometimes it takes more time before we get to that place, I think.
Thank you so much. I think we have a few more minutes, and I have another question from Deborah. Do you have recommendations for how to explore milieus for students at a lottery school? For context, my daughter's high school has students coming from all parts of our city. It has been difficult to develop a sense of community since families are from so many different neighborhoods.
And so is it possible to bring them to the school then for something like a Cooking for Cohesion, or could there be something like a Cooking for Cohesion in different geographic locations, so that you're maybe hosting one Cooking for Cohesion in this community, another one in a different geographic area? I'm just throwing out some ideas, so please get back, feedback to me, because it's definitely more complex. The larger the distances, the more complex it is. I know during COVID, we learned a lot about virtual kinds of things. Some of the teachers made family chandeliers virtually by having families online, each in their own home, each with a bag of materials or an envelope of things, and then they sent their strand of the family chandelier in, and then the teacher did a film, live feed while the kids and the teacher assembled that family chandelier. So I'm wondering if we've learned some strategies using technology that would enable us to still do some rich things, but virtually, if that might be an answer. Never the same as being together, but still dwelling in.
Yeah, very great suggestions. I agree. I think there's a lot we can do to take advantage of the new tools we've learned about to use them. Deborah says thank you.
Okay, and if Deborah has more feedback, if that doesn't make sense, ask her to ask me more questions. I'll try my best.
Alrighty, well, if we don't have any more questions, Debbie, did you have anything else you wanted to share? I have a couple of things I was going to mention before we close the session, but just want to make sure there wasn't anything left to mention here.
Sure. You know what? I think it's not the activity in and of itself, but the fact that you're dwelling in. So my ideas are just examples, just exemplars. So, you know, like in Deborah's community, she has a different context in a different community. So what are some of the principles that you want to hold on to, but then make up your own way that makes sense for you and the families with whom you work? So it's not a matter of it has to be a home visit. It's a matter of how will you dwell in, how will you gain funds of knowledge, parent knowledge, and an indication of home culture. And then I guess the most important question is, what are you going to do with it? Now that you know that, how are you going to use that? How will it change your teaching? How will it change your relationships, the books you put in your class library, the projects you have your kids do, and so on. So it's what you do with what you learn and how you maintain that relationship over time that becomes a really important part of it as well. Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for just wrapping that up so nicely. I definitely think that's a great way to summarize all of the amazing things you've shared today. Thank you so much for sharing for being here with us. If this is your last session for the day, and Debbie, if you look in the chat, you have so many great sentiments here being shared. If this is your final session, please complete the survey that I'm dropping here in the chat. Only if it's your final session for today. We ask that you only take the survey once, so please don't complete this until it's your final session of the day. Our next session, I believe, starts at 2, and all of the information for our sessions for the day are on our website that I can also put in the chat here. Let me grab the link. If you need links to anything for that, and again, thank you everyone for being here. And yeah. And have a great rest of your day. You get a few extra moments between now and the next session.
Thank you so much, Sunny, and thank you to all of you for being here with me today. I really appreciate it.